It makes me grateful for the cool directory app that we have, where I can just go to it and find all of the sisters' phone numbers and click on that if I haven't already saved it on my own phone. It's pretty handy.
High tech, you guys. That's pretty good. All right, we're live in all the places now.
Excellent.
Yeah, you still got 5 more minutes to try to figure out how to get Sister Janice up in here.
I know. Should I try calling her once more?
Thank you.
Well, it's part of the like, let's meet early, so this doesn't stress us out as much.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. Welcome to those who are slowly signing on. We'll start at 2 o'clock. I'm going to silence my cell phones.
Good move.
There she is.
Yay!
Can you hear us, Sister Janice? Maybe not yet.
Maybe not.
One step at a time.
She looks wonderful, though.
Yes.
It changed. Isn't that what we're supposed to celebrate? It changed.
Yes. Woohoo!
Woo-hoo.
She's not answering, so maybe she's intently.
Yeah. Yeah.
Figure it out.
I guess it's less rough than being stuck inside of a whale, right?
Is that the benchmark? Like,
I just put that right here for future use.
Yeah, why not? Zoom is hard,
better
right?
than being in the whale stomach.
Yeah, I know. Pastor Megan, you have given me 2 whoppers today that will be very helpful in my life. Very helpful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah.
That's
what
along the lines of, it could always be worse.
Yeah.
The funny thing is that there are several images from the Bible that you could pull out, right? That you could be like,
It could be
well,
worse.
it's better than being in a furnace.
Yeah.
Oh boy, oh boy.
My spouse is an HVAC technician and is also serves on Synod Council in the Synod that we're members of, and so regularly fixes furnaces in church buildings, and some church buildings are so big there are multiple furnaces, and he regularly names them after biblical characters with little clap. He's like, oh, Meshach is a gift.
No.
It's like, so-
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego should be the only ones who don't have to be the fighters.
It's quite ridiculous and wonderful all at the same time.
Well, that's how you get someone else to volunteer to do it. You're like, see the fun I had? You didn't know that? Yep.
Big glasses are. There's one spot right in the middle where I can see.
That doesn't work so
Better.
That's the problem with good lighting.
Yeah.
It's not as good for glasses wearers.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. 2 more minutes and then we're gonna call our town hall to order.
Excellent.
Yeah. You guys are a lot better at not being silly at the beginning than I am. So good job, Deaconess community.
What's more awkward for people to be signing on and seeing just a bunch of faces not
yeah.
saying anything, or a bunch of people like sort of chattering and having, you know, having some levity? I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to know, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. I'm still rooting for Janice. You can do it, Janice.
Her internet must be doing something funky.
Yeah, her computer went off and on, and yeah, she's been having really good days with it. And then, you know.
Shoot.
Yep. Yeah.
It's always when you go live on something that
Mm-hmm.
it's a little bit tougher, right?
Amen. Yeah.
All right, it's 2:00. Are you guys ready?
We are.
All right. So welcome everyone to our town halls that prioritize the voices of intersectional Lutherans, co-sponsored by Just Lutheran and the Racial Ethnic Ministry Strategies Discipling Team of the Sierra Pacific Synod. I'm Pastor Megan Rohrer, and I will be sharing some information about the logistics of this meeting before we begin. First, those who are joining us on the Zoom webinar will notice that you do not have video or microphone access. This is because we are using the webinar format, which might be different from other Zoom calls you've participated in. Only those who are speaking have the ability to turn their videos and microphones on. And our goal is to center our hearts and our minds and our voices on listening for this conversation. This choice also will decrease the likelihood that the Zoom space will be intentionally disrupted in harmful ways. There is a Q&A section for those who are on the Zoom at the bottom of the page. The Q&A section is where you want to post any questions for the speakers, and typically between 3 and 3:30, I'll lift up those questions and share them. If you are watching on Facebook Live or on any of the other social media platforms, you can use #LutheransListen. And during the time that we're having engaging conversation, I'll be collecting your questions from there as well. If you're in the Zoom webinar, there's also a chat room function, which is the best place to share all the wisdom and knowledge that you have, to connect with each other as a community. You can introduce yourself and use the chat room as you would like. If you are someone for whom the blinking light of the chat room bothers you, if you open the chat room and just pull it to the side and ignore it, that light will stop blinking. So that's the quick way to figure out how to do that. This webinar is being recorded and will be available both on our Facebook event page at www.justlutheran.com under online trainings and curriculums, and as a special bonus on the Deaconess page when you go learn more about them, because you're so excited to do that after this. The evaluation, if you are a part of the Zoom call, will come to you automatically when you turn off your Zoom. Don't worry if you don't have time to fill it out right away after this session. You can also check it out when it is emailed to you tomorrow. And with that, I will let you know that if you are on Zoom, I will be copying and pasting all of these logistics into the chat box so that if you missed them, you can check them out. Before we begin, I want to say that sharing your voice in a town hall is a leap of faith. It's live and it's being recorded. At some point, there might be a technology hiccup. We all need your prayers to help Sister Janice arrive here fully. Know that this is a place where we can embrace our humanness, however we find it through this conversation. And with that, I'm going to hand today's conversation over to Sister Michelle.
All right, thank you, Pastor Megan. It's so good to be with everybody that's here electronically and everybody that's here on the screen in front of me. I'm Sister Michelle Collins. I will introduce myself briefly and then share the virtual microphone with others so they can also introduce themselves. I currently serve as the assistant to the bishop for the Manitoba, Northwestern Ontario Synod of the ELCIC in Canada. I've spent the last several years in serving the Florida Bahamas Synod, and I'll share a little bit more about that. But we are here on behalf of the ELCA Deaconess community, which you'll learn more about throughout our conversation. And I'm really excited to be facilitating just some discussion and a few minutes of chit-chat. I think you'll find that we sisters have quite a bit of joy together when we gather. And hopefully by the end of our time together, you'll have a clearer sense of who we are as a community, why being rostered in the ELCIC is important to us, and what that has to do with these overall conversations about minimizing bias. a huge shout out to Pastor Megan and all of those who have been facilitating this series. If you've been able to see any of them, you know that they're really powerful conversations. So I'm humbled to be part of that ongoing conversation, and also acknowledge that there are those who would have been with us today, but chose to stand with their communities who are in various levels of lament, prayer, and celebration this weekend around different kinds of things. So know that we stand with those for whom these times are difficult and complex, and we send our prayers and support to all of you there. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sister Shanna to go ahead and introduce yourself to us. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what your context is, and some of the intersections that you embody.
Thanks, Sister Michelle. My name is Sister Shanna Williams. I currently live in Eastern North Dakota, and I serve in the Northwestern Minnesota Synod as the chairperson of the Climax Shelley Night Pack program, which is a weekend backpack food program at the school where I teach. I teach special ed at the Climax Shelley School, and have been instrumental in getting the weekend backpack program started to help our students who come from situations where it is sometimes difficult to provide enough food for children in the family. So we send backpacks home with nutritious, kid-friendly food every weekend during the school year. Some of the intersections of my life, I am a sister of the Deaconess community of the ELCA. I have been a sister for 14 years. So I joined the community when I was newly married and just beginning my family. I have a daughter who's 11 years old, so she is pretty awesome and pretty big part of my life. I am a teacher. I grew up on a farm, so I live in a farming community now, not far from where I grew up. So I have moved around the country a little bit, but have come back to where I started again. So that's a little bit about me. I can pass it over to Sister Noreen.
Thank you, Sister Shanna. Hi, I'm Sister Noreen Stevens, and I currently serve as the directing deaconess for the Deaconess community of the ELCA, part of the leadership team with Sister Liz, who will be connecting with you next. I use she, her, hers. I've been a member of this community of women for 33 years and serving in the ELCA that whole time. I've been a first grade teacher. I've done educational ministry in congregations, resourcing ministry for 2 synods, and I've also served on a synod staff, and now with the community and leadership. I've served primarily in urban areas and suburban areas, and thanks be to God and Sister Shanna, I know more about rural areas. So a benefit of being a part of a community where we have intersections as sisters, learning from her has been gift, as I've not served in a rural area. And so with that, I will send it to Sister Liz.
Thank you, Sister Noreen. My name is Sister Liz Culver. I use she, her, her pronouns. And I serve as a part of the leadership team with Sister Noreen. My position is the Director of Vocation and Education for the Deaconess community. So I'll tell you more about that later, but I work with candidates in their formation with what we do to walk people and accompany them through the process of becoming a sister in our community. Some of the intersections that I embody, I identify as queer, and I'm a mom, and I'm a lifelong Pacific Northwest dweller. I live just outside of Seattle, and I've lived just outside of Seattle in some capacity or another my whole life. Before I took this call, I was serving as a community organizer for the synod that I live in on synod staff. I also served as a mission developer before taking this call. And I will pass it on to Sister Michelle. You already shared. Let's see if Sister Janice is available to share.
I think maybe not.
Working on it.
All right, good. Yeah, so we hope that Sister Janice will be with us, and if she's able to join us, then we'll give her a space to reintroduce herself. So just a little bit more about, about me beyond just the name and title. Some of the intersections that I embody as I think about that question. I'm an ELCA deacon. That's an important part of who I am. I'm a sister, both in this community, but I also have lots of siblings that give me my identity. I did not grow up Lutheran, and that continues to be a formative part of my life story, is the journey from being Lutheran to being, or from not being Lutheran to being Lutheran. And I would say that I'm a little bit of a wanderer. I don't have a firm geographical rooting, and so I'm a little bit of a geographical wanderer, and I'm okay with that. So also informs kind of who I am and how I go about my work. So my next question for the group then is, and maybe in this question you can also give a little bit of like the elevator spiel version of how you came to be rostered in the ELCA. So the question is, how is being rostered in the ELCA or ELCIC, how has that been shaped by also being a sister in the Deaconess community? So within that, if you want to give a little bit of your journey to both the community and to the roster. Anybody want to start with this one?
I can start if you'd like. I started my church work when I graduated from college. I had planned originally to be a teacher and decided that that wasn't where I was being called to begin with, and decided to go to seminary. I thought I was going to be a pastor. Largely because that's all I thought there was. I didn't know about the other rosters. At the time, there were 3 other rosters, and I didn't know anything about that. When I got to seminary, I was in the middle of my second year, and middle of my first year, I met my husband, and then who was also a student there. Then he was supposed to go on internship, and I was supposed to go on internship, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't fill out the paperwork. It didn't feel right. So I decided to take some time off and work. And that's when my husband did his internship, and he happened to be at the church that Sister Noreen was a member of. And so he told me one day, you need to meet this Sister Noreen who is at the church here. And I said, why is there a Catholic nun working at the church? And he said, she's not a Catholic nun, she's a deaconess. And so that was my introduction to the Deaconess community. I had never heard of the Deaconess community. I didn't know what it was. And so through conversations with Sister Noreen, I came to realize that the Deaconess community was where I was being called. The aspect of service in community with a community to support you and to help you discern and to be sounding board and support there was where I was really being called. And that aspect of service was huge. Growing up in a rural community where you help one another, I didn't have the words for it, but I'd been doing service all my life. So the Deaconess community really helped me to put words into my actions and shape that sense of service. Then after I became a deaconess, I had a few different calls in different places. My husband and I moved around a lot for different reasons. He was a pastor, and so he had several calls. I had several calls. I did youth work, and I worked at a summer camp. I worked as a church secretary. I did some interim ministry where I helped fill in between pastors in a congregation that needed someone to help. And so eventually, after 10 years of doing all sorts of different things, I came back to teaching, and now I teach in a public school. So that isn't my church call, but that still shapes my sense of service. What I do with those students, even though it's outside of the church, is still ministry. It's still caring and loving and supporting for them. so that, and they do the same for me. I have learned a lot from them, and they are a support for me too. They are encouraging, they ask questions and are excited when they know that things are going on for me too. So it really is a community. That's another aspect of community for me.
Good, thank you. Sister Janice, can you hear us?
Yes.
All right. We're so glad that you're here. If you would,
golly.
are
I'm running out of tissues.
you composed enough to give us a little bit of an introduction about kind of who you are? And
Well, I guess from what I've been hearing, I have two things to answer in one. My name is Sister Janice Rook. I'm 79 years old, unmarried. I live in Pennsylvania. I was set apart as a deaconess 27 years ago, and my profession before going into the community was that of a registered nurse. I was working in the operating room about maybe 3 years after I finished my training in Easton, Pennsylvania. And I felt the need to do something other than the operating room. And one night, out of my Bible, when I opened it for devotions, was an old church bulletin that was dedicated to foreign missions. And so I wrote a note, as they said, to do, and I posted it the next morning. And they said the only nurse they needed in the entire mission field at that time was somebody who had experience in the operating room for 3 years. So that qualified me. So I became a medical missionary with the Lutheran Church, and I was sent to Phoebe Hospital in Liberia, West Africa. And I was there for 5 years. And during that time, the church sent me to school to become a nurse midwife, because the nurse midwife that we had started a training program for the Liberians, and they wanted someone to continue that while she was home on furlough. So I did that, went back to Liberia, and was there for a total of 5 years. I took a position as a certified nurse midwife when I returned to the United States. Matthew 25:45 says that if we do something for the least of these, if we don't do it, we're not doing it for Jesus. But I must admit that I did it 2,293 times for the least of these. I helped that number onto the tax rolls. So I believe God wanted me to move on and serve others and feed his flock in another way. I was introduced to a member of the Deaconess community of the ELCA that we also serve, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. This was at a global mission event. And a few years later, I began the process of becoming a Lutheran deaconess. I attended seminary for 2 years and did an internship caring for the Deaconess retired sisters at our mother house when we had that in Gladwyn, Pennsylvania. And from there, I went to Thompson, where I did home health nursing for 2 years. And then I was called to go to a Black church in Chicago, Illinois, and I was there for 11 years as their parish nurse. Prior to my experience as a nurse, I've really noticed that I was the happiest and most fulfilled at doing something within the church. So it was a way for me to search God more fully by joining the community. As a member of the Deaconess community, I have the support and prayer that I need. And by being able to go to talk to older sisters, their experience as a deaconess really provided solid advice for me when I needed it. And I've been retired now since let's see, about 16 years, I guess it is.
Good. Thank you, Sister Janice. Who else?
I'll be happy to go. So I think that, can you frame the question again, Sister Michelle, just so I'm sure that I'm going to answer it?
Sure, yeah. So while giving a brief version of your call story, how does being in the Deaconess community inform what it means for you to be rostered in the ELCA?
Yeah. So I'll answer it like this. The love of Christ compels us. That is 2 Corinthians 5:14. It's on our cross. You can see it really clearly on Sister Shanna. You can see her cross, and that Sister Carol Wright introduced me to that, and walked with me as I learned more about that. So like many other deaconesses, it was a one-on-one relationship that called me to wonder and to pray with the Spirit and discern a call into this community and the roster in the ELCA. As I was wondering and learning more about the community, it was the history that grabbed me. Watching and seeing women that I knew, right? Faithful mentors in my faith journey now, right? But they were on the forefront. The Deaconess community of the ELCA and its predecessor Deaconess community of the LCA was in places that the church wasn't yet. Elizabeth Fetty, one of our very first deaconesses, well, not first, but a deaconess here in the States, went knocking on doors to get money to open a hospital that is now a part of the New York University hospital system. And our sisters began hospitals in Pennsylvania and in Chicago and in Milwaukee and in Omaha, Nebraska. And our sisters worked with orphans and with widows and TB clinics out in Colorado, in places that the church wasn't yet. And I was fascinated by that. I loved church. I loved it. And like Sister Shanna, I wanted to be a teacher, and I wished those two would go together, and I didn't see any way that they were going together. And then I met Sister Carol Wright, and I'm like, wow, they go together. That is so amazing. That is so great. And so it was the sisters, the history of our community that I saw the sisters living. The love of Christ compels us. They know no other, right? It's that unconditional service to our neighbor in need that they were called into. And then they continued that, right? So they would go in and they would create these social service organizations and be advocates. They go to Congress. Elizabeth Fetty went to Congress to get money from Congress so that they could get ambulances, right? So that they would have what they needed. So it was that love of Christ that was compelling them, the care of neighbor. Love your neighbor as I have loved you, Jesus says. And that radical love was just powerful for me as I was thinking about what it would be called, what it would be to serve with this community, and the strength of these women and their ministries and understanding that. So compelled by the love of Christ, the inspiration, the motivation, and the nurturing of these women who are always there, right? You all don't ever go away. You are always there, and that is just beautiful. So I think that community helped me to see and to learn even more about diaconia, right? To really help me to identify our intentional formation, which I know Sister Liz will talk more about, helped me to identify and to grow in my own understanding and call, and to really hold on to the love of Christ compels us. And I give thanks that as community, we are inextricably connected in that.
Thanks, Sister Noreen.
Oh my gosh, sometimes these questions can be so big, and
Right.
you want to be intentional about how you answer them. There's so much that goes into the discernment process to become a leader in the church and to become a sister in this community. And for me, my story starts from being a part of a family that was really immersed in church. My parents met at a small Lutheran Bible Institute, and neither of them had cousins or aunts or uncles. We grew up without cousins or aunts or uncles. I had one aunt, and my grandparents lived far away. So the community, the family that my parents curated and nurtured my siblings and I in was our church home. And so the congregation that I was a part of became this community for me, this family for me. All these aunts and uncles and grandmas and grandpas and cousins and siblings and what have you showed up in my life through church. And so church was something that that always formed me, and I knew it would always be important in my life. That being said, my dad also worked for Augsburg Fortress when I was a child, and had a fairly big role at Augsburg. So anytime pastors would come through the area, they would always stop at our house. And so I was also surrounded by pastors growing up. And I remember being so young thinking, they have something that I feel there's something there that I want, but I don't know if that's what I want. And so, but I didn't know that there was anything else, right? I thought if you're going to work in the church, you're going to be a pastor, or you're not going to work in the church. I didn't know that there were other options. And so throughout my life discerning growing up, I thought for a minute I'd be a missionary. And I thought for a minute I'd be an ethnomusicologist. I thought for a minute that I'd be a sex therapist. I thought for a minute I'd be all these different things, because somehow I felt there needed to be some way that I could connect the yearnings of my heart with the gift of community that church can offer you. But I just didn't know how that meshed together. Well, and like I mentioned before, being someone who's lived on the West Coast in the Seattle area my whole life, it's not particularly a hotbed for church people. And so I'd never even heard of a deacon or a deaconess or a sister or anything like that before. And one day after college, I heard my bishop preaching in my congregation, and I just felt this sharp stirring. You need to look at what seminary looks like, even though you don't want to be a pastor. And so I came home and told my family, I think I'm going to look into seminary. And they all said, yeah, of course you are. Duh. And I thought, oh my gosh, like, how come I'm the last one to think about this? So long story short, as I was looking through the ELCA website of all places, I was looking at what rostered leadership looks like to see if there was anything other than being a pastor that I might be called to. And I saw this little link to something that said the Deaconess community of the ELCA. And I followed that link and I learned about this community, this intentional community of women identifying leaders called to live on the edges of the world, on the edges of the church, to bring together that which happens in the world to that which happens in the church. And I knew in my bones this settling presence of the Spirit saying, here are your people. And I got so excited. And I entered into candidacy to be a deaconess, and I'd never met one, and I'd never seen one until the community flew me to Chicago for my candidacy interview, where I met sisters for the first time. And I would say that my identity has been shaped by this community in so many ways, it's hard to count. But I'll say one of the most significant things for me is parallel to what Sister Noreen shared. This this opportunity to be a part of a community of women identifying people who have been bold and risk-taking and servant leaders in all of our history, that when I stand somewhere and I say, my name is Sister Liz Culver and I'm a member of this Deaconess community, I have this really tangible experience of being surrounded by this holy witness. Past, present, and future sisters are all with me when I claim this title sister and I say it out loud. And I get to be a part of that. It's the biggest, best gift that shapes my identity ever, I would say.
Oh my goodness. So much in each of these stories that I just want to untangle and like lay out on the table and look at the incredible amount of stuff that you each bring to this. But some of the things that I hear as I listen to these stories, there's a common strand around community, there's a common strand around discernment, there's a common strand around sort of this compelling to serve the neighbor, and a deep desire to stay connected to faith and congregation or church work, right? And I think for me, that's really similar. So the brief version is that I graduated from a Lutheran college with no anticipation of ever being Lutheran or professional Christian, but landed in Minneapolis, and it's hard not to step into a Lutheran church if you're in Minneapolis. And so as I was looking for any sort of faith community to help me sort of patch my young adult angst back together, I was in a Lutheran congregation, and it just brought up a lot of questions around, if you guys say this, how do you get to there? And there just was a lot of uneasiness. And so my pastor in his wisdom said, well, why don't you go to seminary and ask those questions? So I went to seminary with no expectation of being a professional Lutheran, with no desire to work for the church. If anybody had said, why are you doing this? I would have said, because I really want to be a really great Sunday school teacher. I want to understand how Lutherans understand faith formation so that I can teach Sunday school in a way that helps kids connect what we're saying in worship to what they're experiencing in life. But in order to go to seminary, I was told you have to declare, well, do you want to be rostered? Are you going through candidacy? And I thought, oh, well, okay. Is that what we do if we go to seminary? Sure. So I was entranced. I knew I didn't want to be a pastor. And they said, well, there's these other options. You could be an associate in ministry. And I said, sure, that sounds great. So I was entranced as an associate in ministry. And then as I was coming up to endorsement, the input of wisdom voices around me said, have you ever considered being a diaconal minister? I looked into it a little bit and I thought, ooh, I really like that external perspective of standing in the church, but looking at the world, standing in the world, but looking at the church, and kind of being in that marginal space. And so I was endorsed as a diaconal minister. And then as I was doing my diaconal ministry formation project, I learned about World Diaconia and this federation of global diaconal organizations. And I thought, that's what I want to be part of, is this kind of global expression of what it means to be called to ministry and service. And then a diaconal minister said to me, have you ever thought about being a deaconess? And so I looked into it and it seemed like a good thing to do. So I was approved as a deaconess. So the question about like, what does it mean to be on the roster of the ELCA was a very intentional conversation for me and my candidacy committee. But each time as I went to these candidacy interviews, they would say, well, why don't you want to be a pastor? Are you sure you don't want to be ordained as a pastor? Well, why don't you want to be a pastor? And so I got stronger and stronger convicted about, no, there's something else that's calling me to ministry in the world besides being a pastor. And so for me, being in the deaconess community gives me that history that others were talking about, gives me that context within which I can form what it means for me to be called to the world from a really deep place of commitment and theology. So, yay. So actually what we're here to talk about today, and we are going to sort of need to keep these responses a bit concise because we're, whatever, watching the time. But as a deacon or as a deaconess in the ELCA, how have you experienced, what has bias looked like in your ministry? How have you experienced bias? And how did you navigate that? And what role did the community play in your experience or navigation of bias?
As I was thinking about this last night, I really have, I think, been very blessed in that I really haven't experienced outright bias as a lot of people have. But then came memory of when I was in seminary, the professor that I was assigned to as invited me.
Sister Janice, I just want to pause because your microphone is kind of crackling. So I don't know if you can you move a little bit closer or something? Because I just want to make sure that we're catching what
I
you're
don't even
saying.
know where it is.
That's okay. Carry on. Never mind.
Okay. This professor that I had, he was assigned to me as advisor. And when I went to see him as all the rest of his advisees did, he asked, said he wanted each one of us to stay here and he talked individually. And so I was so I was sitting there and then he says, he turned around and he literally just fanned the papers. Turns around to me and says, you want to be a sister? And I said, yes, that's my goal. And he's like, Catholic. And I said, no. He says, okay, well, you can go out and bring the others in. Well, as I went along, I found out by speaking to some of the other students, they told me that he did not approve of women in seminary on campus. He was also one of the, so my experience was a lot of the directing deaconess. There was a couple of deaconesses that I spoke to and were trying to help me over them. And I also had to talk to the dean, which I did, and he asked me if I wanted to switch advisors, and I said, well, yes. So he gave me another one with my approval, and that worked out very, very well. Along the way, it was support of because so that was my experience. Really sad. I felt like I had some bias. It was strong.
So Sister Janice, your microphone was really crackly, but what I could hear, I think you were talking about an experience with an academic advisor who had some opinions about your potential, maybe because of you being a woman, and the deaconess community helped, or the deaconess leadership helped advocate for you in that, and through that, or supported you through that, and you were able to find a different advisor. Is that a good enough summary of the story?
That was perfect.
Great. Thank you. Anybody else?
I'll share. So the bias that I experienced pretty much through my whole ministry, except for my last couple of calls, has been around pay equity. That I have been told, one, referencing the fact that I wasn't the breadwinner in the family and therefore didn't need to make as much as a colleague who was in a similar position to me. I had more education than him. This was in congregational ministry. And disappointment, that's not even quite strong enough of how I felt about that. This was the late or early 90s, so it's a few years ago now, but I know this is still happening. So I name it as a bias that continues. And other opportunities where there could have been pay equity and was not, because I was not ordained to word and sacrament, although the expectations that were a part of my job description were equal to that of my colleagues who were word and sacrament ministry. So that is a bias that I have navigated and continue to navigate with some of our sisters. How has the community helped? I think one way is to be a support and listening, as Sister Janice said, right? To be a support and have others gone through it, and what are some questions I can ask? What's some experience in other synods even, so that some of that might be pointed to and I can work with and help to educate. And so giving thanks for the sisters who have helped me to navigate and really to formulate questions that help to educate and to change systems.
Thanks, Sister Noreen.
I think a lot of the biases that I have encountered are kind of along those same lines. What is, as a woman in ministry, how do people perceive me different than my husband? Because both of us were in ministry at the same time, not usually in the same context, but at the same time. And how do people see, what do they expect from him versus what they expect from me? And how to speak to that when their expectations are not what is actually going to happen, or not what I feel or my husband feels comfortable living into those expectations when they aren't realistic or aren't what's actually happening. And I think that the Deaconess community has been a sounding board, and my sisters, I have a group of sisters that are my shoulder to unload on when I need to. I'm there for them too, and to say, okay, am I to kind of feel things out and say, is this really what I think is happening here? And or am I overreacting, or am I underreacting, or what's going on here? So a big part of the community has been that individuals that are there to give advice, to help sort things out when stuff isn't making sense. So.
I think one of the ways that I've experienced bias is feeling left out when being referenced to as church leadership or not. And so I know that lots of synods and congregations and the ELCA as a whole has really been doing some beautiful intentional work about being inclusive of deacons and pastors when they're talking about leaders and ministers in the church. And there have been huge strides in the last even just 4 years or so that have been so tremendously helpful for candidates as they go through the process now. But when I was a candidate, there had never been a deaconess candidate in my synod before, and there had been very, very few diaconal minister candidates. And so I didn't get the opportunity to be discerned with about my call from my candidacy committee or my pastors in my congregation or other people, because they didn't know that there was another option to discern. And when I was very first, in my very first call, I often felt left out when leaders would say, and all of the pastors come stand over here. And then I was just stand there like this. And I think the gift of being a part of this community in the midst of navigating that bias was that I could look at my sisters, current and historically, and see where they decided to be bold and stand where they belonged, even if they weren't always invited. And so I started being able to take bolder steps. And when they would say, pastors over here or clergy over here, I would just go there too. And pretty soon it became something that I was allowed to be a part of, or it was assumed, or they would say, pastors, oh, and don't forget Sister Liz, which felt like a gift from the community, teaching me how to navigate that in a positive way from their experience. And the church is changing, right? So while we still have growing to do to pay attention to not forgetting people who have been called as leaders, who have gone through seminary, who've been trained and educated and followed checking all the boxes that we're asked to, and then neglected on the other side. That's changing, but we still have work to do.
Yeah, I think mine is kind of similar to what you said, Sister Liz. Besides the fact that going through candidacy, every time I felt like I had to explain to my candidacy committee why I was a candidate for the deaconess community and not a candidate to be a pastor, right? And so every time they're like, but you're articulate, you can think theologically and all, and and that's not, I'm not being called to be a pastor at this time, right? But constantly having to sort of reintroduce to my candidacy committee, what is the deaconess roster? Why am I choosing that? In what way is what I'm doing part of the candidacy process was a big thing. But then also in my first call, the first time that we had a synod kind of gathering of lots of people where there was the reaffirmation of ordination vows. And so the service was written in such a way that the pastors were invited forward to do their affirmation of ordination. And I was not included in that, and instead was included with the lay volunteer leaders in the congregation. And so then having conversation with my pastor, my colleagues afterwards, saying, what does that communicate about the role of the deacon and the role of a rostered minister beyond the fact that I'm a deacon? So, and I think the deaconess community gave me the space to grow that voice within me as we talked together about where we needed to stand up for ourselves, what it meant to advocate to those around us, and supported one another when we experienced those kinds of challenges. And so then maybe on the other side of that, right? On the other side of that, what has contributed to a ministry context where you would have said you were really able to flourish? What were some of the things that contributed to a positive ministry environment? Sister Liz.
I'd like to go first on that one. Yeah, I had a 2-part first call, and halftime was as a co-mission developer with a pastor of a network of house churches. And this network of house churches engaged in kind of a modified community organizing cycle in our neighborhoods. And to be on a team with a colleague who really deeply understood the differentiation of role between pastor and deacon, and also really clearly understood that in his opinion and my opinion most of the time, pastors can't do their work as well as they're called to without deacons in their life. And deacons can't do our work as well as we're called to without pastors in our life. Both calls are so dependent on one another. And so to be in a position where I could work with a pastor who valued what it was I was called to do and shared in the overlap, but didn't try to share in the differentiation was a real gift. That, and also knowing that in my first call positions, I was able to build into my time off opportunities to be with the community. So making sure that I could gather with the assembly when we gathered, that I could attend events that we had, that it was it was allowed to be important, that it didn't take my time off for me, but it was a part of my call to be engaged in this community and be formed by this community. That was a real opportunity for me to flourish.
Good, thanks.
I think where I am currently has been the place that I have flourished the most. And I think it's a little bit maybe ironic that it is not a church call. It's not, and maybe not ironic, maybe just that I have that one foot in each world. But the bulk of my professional life is not a church job. it's, I teach in a public school. I am not Sister Shanna at school. At school, I'm Mrs. Williams. And that the kids, that's how the kids know me. That's how the teachers know me. But they also know that I work for the church too. And I live in an area, and I teach in a tiny school where that is maybe more possible than it would be in a larger place. I live in a place that is largely Lutheran, and people understand that there are people that work in both worlds. And but my ministry is not what you would think of as a church ministry. My ministry is just, I care for my kids at school. I help them with their homework. I as a special ed teacher, I make sure that they're getting their accommodations and getting what they need to deal with their learning disabilities or their behavioral disabilities or things like that. That is my ministry, and it's not on the face of it, it's not outwardly ministry, but that's how I approach it. I am doing what God's calling me to do to help these kids have the best life that they can, to learn them the best way that they can. The call piece of it that fits into that box that we kind of need to check for church stuff is the backpack program that is drawing together members of the community, the Deaconess community, which right now helps fund our backpack program with their community grant that we are very thankful for. And members of the church. There's a local church gives us space to store the food because we don't have room at school. And then there's other organizations in the community that are donating time and donating money and helping with that. And it is showing the kids too that there's a whole community of people that care for them, that I think a few kids, I've kind of seen the light bulb go on in their head where they're like, wait a minute, I'm not all by myself here. Like, I maybe don't have a whole lot of support at home. Things are tough at home, but look at all these people that are like coming together to do something for me. And I think that's been very, very powerful, and very much a place that has allowed me to use my gifts in a way that I wouldn't have thought I would have been able to.
Good, thank you. So I'm gonna go ahead, Sister Noreen.
Just really quick, I would echo a lot of what Sister Liz said. In a call I had in a synod office where the bishop respected the history of the community and celebrated that and was eager to learn more and open to ask questions and to walk with me as I was growing into that call and learning as well, and recognized that the deacon on the staff was doing the same work that the other assistants were being called into doing. And so that recognition and celebration of the role of deacon was just beautiful to be able to see and allowed for me to flourish. But in the midst of that, I should say, a lot like what Sister Liz said, the opportunities to be with my with the community was never question asked about that. And the opportunities to serve the greater church in a variety of different ways, task force, committees, seminars, things like that, right? It was encouraged and celebrated, yeah, and motivated, right? Go and do. And so that was just beautiful because I think it allows for the whole of the person, right? Not just what you're doing in that position, that particular call, but the whole of who I was. And I really felt like she recognized.
So just for the interest of time, I want to, kind of move down my list a little bit and ask about the questions that you get asked that you wish people already knew the answers to, right? Questions that you get asked that, that you wish people already knew the answers to or would find out in other ways, didn't need to be asked.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yep, we can.
Okay.
Give it a try.
Okay. The thing that I always got asked for me that was just time and time again is, how come they let a Catholic sister work in the Catholic Church?
Yeah.
And of course, I had to go into the explanation as to what a deaconess was. First of all, that I wasn't a Catholic. I do go to seminary. And of course, the children are the ones that ask questions. They said, well, what do you know about Jesus? Because we know about Jesus. And do you take vows like the sisters do? We share our professional training along with the service to the church with either a church-related organization or some other organization of service.
Yeah.
We can marry, which of course is something that shakes a lot of people up. And of course, most of us, are the people that have asked as well, have seen pictures of the old deaconesses with the usual garb on. And they want to know why I didn't have that. Mm. And I told them, I said, well, my garb in a way is the cross that I wear. And I've had so many compliments on that. Mm. One of the kids asked me one day, why don't you wear garb? And I thought, well, when I went for my interview in Chicago, after I had a meeting with the staff and some of the members of the congregation, they wanted to know if I had any questions for them. And I said, yes. I said, the first question I have is, I said, I can wear a black dress with a white collar if you want, or I can, and she stopped me in mid-sentence. She says, we like color around here because, you know, the black community really likes a lot of color. So I never wore a black dress or even a dress either. We all have different gifts, but we all have the same love for our God.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
We desire to share his love with others. And I think, to me, that says that's what a deaconess is.
There you go. There you go. How about others? What other questions have you received that you maybe wish didn't need to be asked?
I think I kind of welcome questions. I maybe it comes from that heart of a teacher. I enjoy some of those conversations because they're usually really interesting because it's you can see a real curiosity, especially from, like Sister Janice said, kids. I occasionally will preach in the congregations around the area where I teach, and there are students of mine who are members of those congregations, and I can see this, they don't recognize my name often when they see it in the bulletin or they aren't paying attention, but then I walk to the front of the church and they get this look like, wait a minute, I know you, but you're not in the right place. And then I will get questions from students and from parents too about what it is that I do and why I'm up there preaching and stuff like that. But I think it would be great if more people knew the background of the deaconess community. And I think I use those opportunities to be able to share that with them and where I come from and why I'm called sister. And no, I'm not Catholic, and yes, I can be married. You've met my husband, you've met my daughter, you know, that kind of stuff. So,
yeah.
I'm going to pop in for just a second because one of our questions is, why are you called sister? Right? Why is that? You could be called deacon, right? Why is that the title that you all use?
I'm going to pitch that to Sister Noreen.
Oh, I was thinking you were going to sum it up in a nutshell, Sister Michelle. You're really good at that. Sister is part of our history. And so our community came from Germany, and the women in the community in Germany were called sister, and that has remained our title. And even as we became a part of the deacon roster in the ELCA and the diaconal ministers roster in the ELCIC, we kept the title of sister. So you'll see sometimes a deacon in the ELCA will write sister, like I might write Sister Noreen Stevens, ELCA deacon. But it is that sister connects me to this community.
And I think more broadly, the title sister has often been associated with the diaconate across denominations. So in our thinking, we think of it as being a Catholic diaconate, but actually in history, the title sister, lots of denominations have used that title to reference intentional community of women who serve as their version of the diaconate. And so that's the tradition that we come from. And as the variations of the ELCA or the Deaconess community in the American Lutheran Church, we maintained that title.
I think there's also something.
I understand that the nurses in Britain are called sisters.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there also seems to be something that's very like community family supportive about the way that you all are. I don't know if others have been moved by this, but for me it was maybe the Holy Spirit wanted your microphone to be a little garbled, Janice, just so that we could see how much everyone was rooting for you, right? Every single sister was like, yes, you are saying wonderful things, so that you didn't feel uncomfortable that your microphone wasn't working well. And it was, as someone who is a pastor, it's the kind of collegiality we long for, but is a little bit harder because it can sometimes feel like if one person is successful, is that because people don't like my congregation a little? Like there is we haven't quite figured out collegiality yet. And so it's been kind of wonderful to watch the ways that you guys love each other and have this kindness for each other. And from my perspective, it seems like calling each other sister hopefully helps with that a little bit. But could you share some of the ways that you nurture your community? And because my hunch is it's intentional that you guys are loving each other this much. Could you speak a little bit about that?
I'm going to pitch that to Sister Liz, unless you want to send it back to me.
Oh, I was hoping you'd pitch it to Sister Noreen. Yeah, why don't you take a shot with it first, Sister Michelle? I'd like to hear how you answer that question.
Yeah, so I think that there's the practical logistical things of being intentionally committed to gathering and then equipping people to serve together in different kinds of ways. So even as a candidate, I was invited to be on a committee, and in that committee then I became, like I was nurtured by those around me in that committee who had history deeper than mine. And there's also, so there's that intentional stuff, right? We commit to being together in assembly. You make it if you can. Over the last several years, we've developed some online prayer gatherings that we commit to coming if we can. We create a lot of intentional opportunities for connection. But then outside of those intentional opportunities, there's a ton of unintentional or informal commitment to one another that is nurtured just through, I inherit it. So I feel like I just kind of inherited it from the sisters that are older than me. And as I watched the way that they interacted with one another, I was infused with their care for each other. And so that then informed, how I interacted with those younger than me, so to speak. It's in our communal story. It's in how we talk about what it means to be us. It's in how we do worship together. It's in how we celebrate life milestones, how we grieve with loss and struggle with one another, right? It's in those emails and phone calls and cards. Oh my goodness. I get a Valentine's Day card from a sister I've never met, and I've gotten a Valentine's Day card from her for the last 10 years that I've been in the community. So it's just that kind of just deep individual, but also corporate commitment. This is who we are. And so on our good days, we do it intentionally. On our bad days, it does it to us. Do you want to add anything to that, Sister Liz?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great. I think that you're absolutely right. We dive into it really intentionally. We hold almost sacred the title. Like when you get the title in your formation process or in your candidacy process is really significant, and we celebrate with you in a really fantastic way. You get the title sister in our community at a rite that we experience in the midst of community when we're gathered at assembly. And when you arrive to that assembly as a candidate, you have a name tag that says your name, Liz Culver, let's say. And then you go through the rite, and then you get a new name tag that says Sister Liz Culver. And everybody's so intentional about claiming that with you in that moment. It's a huge transformational ritual that we experience together. And I would say as a sister who has had children while being a member of the community, I've brought some nursing babes with me to assembly, and these sisters are legit aunties. Like, no joke. We buy into the familial relationship with such intensity and intention. It's just unbelievably beautiful. There is a particular sister who makes it a big piece of her ministry to hand make cards for all the holidays, for all the kids of sisters in the community. Individually, one by one, my 3 kids get their own card that's age appropriate and specific to their likes. Like, this is family, and the good and the bad of it, right? We always come back to the fact that we are a family together. It's really beautiful.
I will second that familial piece. My daughter was 4 months old when I brought her to assembly the first time. And since then, when I talk with her, I usually call the sisters, Aunt so-and-so, or, and so she knows them as family. And she hasn't seen a lot of them since then, but she gets the same cards every holiday and stuff too. And it is a family piece. Mm-hmm.
I just have to add that about kids, right? My youngest son said to me once, Mom, it is so weird that there's all these women that are always praying for me. And they know me. And they know me like really well, Mom. That is just so weird. Well, then he turned 22 and he said, yeah, that's really, really important.
So at the beginning of the introductions that you all had, I heard that you named this community as a community of people who are female identified, right? Can you speak to why it's a community for people who are female identified?
Well, it's not that we don't say men can't join, but we haven't had anybody that's even applied, I don't think. They're scared by all the women.
I think there's also more to that, though.
Yeah, can I take a stab at that, and then we can have others also speak to it. So Pastor Megan, in 2015, when the ELCA was looking at taking the 3 rosters and making it into one, the deacon roster, our community had intentional conversation on who are we as community? Will we continue as community? And really took time together to talk that through and to wonder, who are we and how are we moving forward? And so out of that came, yes, we are going to continue to be a community of women and to name that. And then in 2016, we said, as we are claiming to be a community of women, we recognize it is important for us and our call into this community to be welcoming of female identifying people. And so that then moved us into 2016, and we have a welcome statement that you can see on our website. And at that same time, we became a Reconciling in Christ community. And so are a partner with Reconciling Works, and give thanks for all that they are teaching us daily and these opportunities. Sister Liz, I know you are part of the writing team of the welcome statement. I don't know if you have more.
Sure, just to, I love what you said, Sister Noreen, and I think I'll just add that the Deaconess community in and of itself has been around for 135 years through our predecessor church bodies. And in the midst of that, we started letting women who were married be a part of the community in the 70s. And we've just been on the edges of a marginalized community as women who couldn't be pastors before women could be pastors were in the community. Women who weren't married had a place to be. Women, like we just keep paying very intentional attention to where we came from in the re-evaluation of who we are and who we're becoming. And so in the midst of that, as we live into this welcome statement where we say we're a community of women identifying people, we also have women identifying candidates who use gender expansive pronouns. And we're living into that in a way that's really beautiful and holy. And the other piece that I'll add in the midst of that is that, like you've heard over and over and over again in this last hour or so, we're a really intentional community. And so nothing sits and stays the same forever just because that's how it's been. So we continually reevaluate what it looks like to be community and what matters to us and who is a part of our community without exclusion regularly, and pay attention to that. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, you're again making this pastor a bit jealous of, right? Because if only it was that easy to help an intentional community be ever changing. I like your spunk about it, and I like your spirit about it, but whew,
Doesn't mean it's always easy.
Well, that's right. We do it anyway, though, right? I was wondering, so for me, this is my first time getting to have intentional conversations with the Deaconess community. I'm wondering if you can help people know how, if their congregation or their community wanted to have a deaconess, how does that process work? Do they pick one they like and then make a job description that they want to pay them? Do they make a job description and then seek some deacon to fill that call? Like, what is that process of discernment like for faith communities that want to pay you properly?
Can I just answer one really quick, and then Liz, go for it, or Sister Michelle, right? So Pastor Megan, there's no box. There is no box of how you would call a deaconess. There you go. Take it, Sister Liz.
Oh my gosh. No, that's true. Oftentimes deacons and sisters in our community have to do some real groundwork to figure out how to make a call. And so there are often times where a sister or a candidate has an intentional relationship with a congregation and they want to build something together. That happens. Other times, as congregations are thinking that they want to expand their leadership, we have some really beautiful synod leadership across the ELCA that's intentional when a congregation comes to them and says, we think we want to have a second pastor for youth and family, or for outreach, or for something like that. Synod staff can say, well, that sounds great, but have you thought of a deacon? And so then deacons can be called into those places in gifted relationship with synod leadership. It's important for deacons and sisters in our community to be in relationship, visible relationship with their synods and congregations, so that people know it's an option. Because like I said, when I was entering into candidacy, I'd never even heard of a sister before. There are synods and candidacy committees that have never engaged in a process with a sister or a deaconess before. And so there's a lot of work like that we need to do. But I would say that the expansiveness of what deacons can be called to do is infinite.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add to that is that in terms of like calling a deaconess specifically, there's, right, like probably through the avenues you can do that. But generally, discernment about rostered ministers is your ministry vision as a congregation directing you towards a minister of word and service, or is your vision for ministry directing you towards calling a minister of word and sacrament? Right, like the more that congregations would expose themselves to the possibility that a pastor isn't the only option when thinking about expanding ministry, when thinking about growing their staff for the next phase of ministry, whatever that looks like, or when social service agencies are looking for some connection to the church, to think, well, maybe there's someone other than a pastor that we could have on our staff. So just that, like, expanding beyond just a pastor as the solution is a really great place to start.
Yeah, and the very first miracle Jesus does in the Gospel of Mark is to heal Simon Peter's mother so she can be a deacon to the community. So
Amen.
that's maybe what we should do. Right? Insert commercial right there.
That's right.
We have also some questions about what the history of the deaconess community is. I've gleaned a little that there are things that come from Germany. Can you tell us a little bit about that history and how it's kind of come to be a part of our Lutheran being in the United States?
I mean, I'll start it, but I'm sure that someone else can pick it up. So the way that I understand it, we trace our story back to 7 German Lutheran deaconesses in Germany who were invited to come over to join a Lutheran pastor to start or to work in a hospital. And so that was kind of, there was a deaconess movement in Germany. That history is much deeper than, a Lutheran deaconess movement in Germany. And so that history then transported then when Lutheran pastors were coming to the US from Germany, they knew about these deaconesses that could help, particularly in the areas of healthcare, caring for orphans, those kinds of things. And so the sisters were invited to help start some of that healthcare ministry that some strategic pastors had in their mind. And then from there, it kind of expanded into intentional mother houses, and as all the different versions of Lutherans formed themselves in the US, many of them had versions of deaconesses in their European counterparts. And so those versions of deaconesses came with them. And then as those Lutheran bodies merged or changed or adjusted, so did the deaconesses that came with them. So that's a very brief overview.
I think also important in our story is the education that has always been a part of our history. And so in those mother houses, there were schools for church workers and nursing schools that we had. And so education of all God's people was also a part of our history. So we weren't just educating deaconesses, but also educating other church workers was very important to us. And we continue that today with our J-term that we have yearly. So yeah, the educational piece is very important and critical. I want to say something about the German community. Kaiserswerth General Conference continues today, and that is our roots out of Germany. And as Sister Michelle mentioned earlier, the importance of the world community that we're a part of, World Diaconia Federation and Kaiserswerth General Conference are very important. And those communities we are intentional in our relationship with them as well. And I have to tell you, during this COVID time, it has been a blessing to hear and to learn from them, and to know that the prayers of our community and our whole of our country are being lifted up by our communities in the whole of the world. So we are strong here in the ELCA and ELCIC, and we are blessed by the community of the world.
I think along with that education piece, is a lot of nurses were trained by deaconesses in the deaconess training schools, or they came into the community for a little while, became deaconesses, were trained as nurses, and then eventually left the community to go back out into the world. And so there's a long history of that nursing being part of it. Yeah. Lots of hospitals and nursing homes and stuff like that that still have that deaconess name in them because they were started by deaconesses.
But the big hospital close to Philadelphia, Lankenau, an awful lot of nurses came out of there, and it spread further west. And I think it's the University of Pittsburgh, that the roots are there of the deaconess community as well. And I graduated from a little hospital in Easton, Pennsylvania. And when I went away from my psychiatric affiliation, I had the opportunity to meet up with some nurses that were being trained at Lankenau. And I looked at their cap and I looked at my cap when we wore them at that time. They're very, very similar. There was just two little creases in the back that made my cap different from Lankenau's. And I did some investigating and found out that there was a deaconess who started the Easton Hospital.
Oh.
So the roots are really traveling throughout the country.
And I scooched my camera over just slightly so you can see Florence Nightingale behind me, taught by Lutheran nursing professors who taught us how to social distance when we are sick.
Right? So her claim to fame there, right? That she went through training in the Deaconess Hospital.
Yeah.
by
her time with the Deaconess community in Germany.
Yeah, so Lutherans, get some good deaconess trained icons in your spaces, and then we can all be celebrating this, right? One of the questions that we have, I'm gonna kind of slightly reword a little bit. I think there's a little bit of confusion because the Greek word diakoneo, translated minister when it's talking about men in the Bible, and served dinner when it's talking about women in the Bible, means deacon. And it's a popular word right now. And so there are synods who have deacons like you all, who are a part of the deaconess community, or the Episcopal deacons who also go to 2 years of seminary, or the Presbyterian deacons, which get elected and then do a task of caring for people. And then there's also some synods that have created diakoneo or communities that are lay individuals who are intentionally praying for a community, right? And so there's all these different ways that the word deacon is being used, even in our Lutheran church. And so it's super confusing for people who are trying to sort it out. I imagine it's tough for you guys. Can you speak to, I'm assuming you've gotten this question before, right? Can you speak to a way that people can explain the differences between these types of deacons that we have in the Lutheran Church and in different synods?
Can I take that one, sisters? So the way that I say it is that we come from the same foundation, our relationship, but the things that to pay attention to are the relationship to the church and the experience of formation and training. So lots of deacons have how they relate to their governing body is a distinction, and then where and how they do their training is a distinction. But that they all come from the same historical theological concept, the same theological understanding, is absolutely true. So in some sense, you can sort of think of us as family tree extensions of the same core family, right? So we're sort of long lost relatives of one another. The differences are in education, formation, and then accountability to the larger bodies. So some local deacons aren't accountable to larger bodies, they're only accountable to their local congregation. Some deacons are paid, some deacons are not. Some deacons are volunteers, some, right? And so those are the things that I sort of, that's where the conversation goes. How are they formed? Who are they accountable to? But this understanding that they all come from the same historical and theological grounding.
I have a pinch to add to that, just a little bit. I think one of the things that the church is actively trying to engage in a more intentional way is the priesthood of all believers, right? And so we as a church, in the Lutheran Church in particular, make some vows at our baptism that call us to live into diaconia, the service of others, the love of God, of ourselves, of our neighbors, of creation. That's serving the world and working towards justice in the world is a part of every single person's baptismal vocation. That's who we all are called to in our baptism, to diaconia, right? But there are those who are called to what we recognize as the diaconate. And the diaconate is what we call those deacons who are called to equip diaconia to live more fully into their baptismal vows, right? So you have everybody called to diaconia, and then you have rostered deacons who are called to the diaconate so that we might encourage others and equip others to live more fully into their baptismal vocation. And then back to what Sister Michelle said about where that diaconate accountability comes from. Does it come from a national church? Does it come from a community? Does it come from a congregation? Does it come from your baptismal vows? Those are the different spaces where the articulation branches off.
As a part of that encouragement, right? The encouraging of people to kind of live their best, live the call that's coming to them in times like these. I wonder if during these chaotic times, like we're in the middle of a pandemic, there's a fair bit of protesting happening right now, right? There is some economic stuff going on with unemployment and the economy being really difficult. There's all these things that are kind of swirling and could make it so that we're only focusing on what's not going right. Where do you notice hope or grace in the world, and how do you encourage it to grow bigger?
I think where I notice it is in those relationships, in the relationships that are growing right now, the relationships that were already established that do the supporting and do and are there when the difficult times happen. You cultivate those when things are going well, so that they are there when things are not going well. I think there's the quote from Mr. Rogers that said when he was young, he would get upset when things happened, and his mother told him to look for the helpers, look for the people that are helping. And that is my hope, is that things are bad in a lot of different places. There's a lot of stuff going on, but people are helping. People are stepping into those spaces, and there's lots of different avenues to do that, lots of different lanes, but there are people stepping into them. It's not, nobody's dropped it cold, said, I'm not doing this. Like no one's run completely away, and disappeared completely. There's somebody everywhere doing something to help.
I do a lot of work with our partners with the community, and what more we can do together is hope-filled, right? As we walk together, as we are in protests together, as we are walking on the Hill and speaking to senators and congresspeople, there is hope in those relationships that we're building, in those partnerships where we're working as a community to change systems so that all of God's creation might flourish.
And I find hope too in our theological center, right? I mean, particularly as deacons, but also just as those who believe that God came into the world when the world was super messy and stayed in the world, even as the world got messier. And that at the center of our faith narrative is this story of God incarnate in human form, hanging on the cross, declaring forgiveness and the possibility of redemption. And so that story is true. That story is true for us, even as it feels like there's darkness and turmoil and chaos. That's kind of where God does God's thing. God has always done God's thing in the midst of those kinds of environments. And so as we hold on to that narrative, I think it gives us hope to hang in there with others who are also experiencing that turmoil as the presence of Christ in the midst of the world.
I think if I could tag on to Sister Shayna, I think they draw out her wording and use the word of caring. You see people who would have passed by one another and never acknowledged even their presence, but now there's caring that you see going on between different people. One thing that just stuck in my mind was how there was a white man who was being beat up, and several black men went over and shielded him, picked him up, and carried him away. It was almost like the Good Samaritan that you were seeing happen in today's world. And it's little things like that, I think, they give you hope. Without hope, we have nothing.
And I would be remiss to neglect the hope that I feel in the fact that our community, while small, 80 to 85 sisters in our community, a quarter of them are candidates in formation with us. And the number of people across the ELCA and the ELCIC who are in conversation with me or with their synods discerning a call to rostered leadership in the diaconate or participation as a sister in this community is phenomenal. And I find so much hope and joy thinking about how the church can be changed by more deacons. I just think that's fantastic.
Well, I think from my experience when I joined the diaconate, mostly it was older women or old women who were my sisters. Now to see all age groups coming into the diaconate, that to me is a lot of hope.
Right. And so I've loved everything that you all have lifted up. It's been for a first encounter of having speakers come to our synod, like, what a delight. I hope it inspires people to discern if the diaconate is for them. I hope it inspires congregations to discern if having a deaconess come and be a part of their community is for them. I hope it will just inspire people to be better colleagues with each other and to live intentionally and do justice out in the world. And I'm so grateful that you all joined us. So just thank you so much for that. Sister Michelle has agreed to provide us with an ending prayer or blessing or whatever pops out. But did you want to say something first, Sister Noreen?
I just wanted to say thank you for the invitation, Pastor Megan. It is a gift for us to be able to share about our community and welcome others to explore it with us. Thank you.
And I have to apologize for my technical difficulties.
All good.
You can if you want, but I learned a lot from them.
All right, let's pray together. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Gracious God, thank you for the gift of life. Thank you for the gift of hope. Thank you for the gift of community and relationship. Thank you for this time to share one another's stories, to listen deeply to one another. Thank you for those who have given their time to listen, whose faces we don't see. We pray for the impact of these conversations, not just this week's, but all the conversations in this series, that through them, ears would be opened, hearts would be opened, and your people would be transformed. And we commit all things into your hands. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Mhm.
Thank you everyone for joining us. It's lovely to have you. See you next time. Next week we will have a town hall. I just haven't been able to announce our speakers yet, so live in the mystery.